My warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, to former Senator Mr. Gay Barnett, to Honorable Michael Kirby, AC, CMG, and of course to Eric Sidotti, our co-host, my good friend. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Gary Barnett, and I will keep my introductions to the minimum as the information is already in public domain. We distributed it to you, and we have quite tight time schedule tonight. Allow me to mention that Gay Barnett is a lawyer who worked both in Australia and overseas in Washington, D.C. as a lawyer in various law firms. He is also a company director. He established and managed his award-winning government and public affairs business offices in Hobart and Canberra. He's also an author who authored several books, including Make a Difference, A Practical Guide for Lobbying, or to Lobbying. And what's most important, he's the former senator for Tasmania, who had senior parliamentary and government roles in both government and opposition. What's important from the point of view of today's debate, that as senator, he supported family values and was instrumental in the successful 2004 Howard government amendment to the Marriage Act, which declared that marriage is a union between a man and a woman. He's married, got 3 children, and enjoys sports. Please welcome Gay Barnett. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Sev for that introduction, and to Sev and Eric from the Whitlam Institute and the University of Western Sydney for hosting this event. Congratulations on that, because this topic, in my view, is very important, and I think it's great to have public debate and discussion in a democracy like Australia on issues like this. And I do want to acknowledge, obviously, the State Member of Parliament and Helen, and acknowledge your time to be here tonight. I appreciate that, and the members and guests, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, and also the school children who are here, I think from a local school. That's fantastic, and I appreciate your interest in the topic, and obviously any questions that flow through. And also to acknowledge the Honourable Michael Kirby. I am in distinguished company, and Michael Kirby, of course, is well known to all of you, but I first met him personally when, on behalf of the Liberal Lawyers Association of Tasmania, invited him to speak at an event in Hobart in the early 1990s. And as you can understand, he spoke very well, erudite message, and it was greatly appreciated by all and sundry. So in terms of same-sex marriage, I'd like to start by saying this, that the pain in the eyes was visible. The grief, sadness and sense of loss expressed by the donor-conceived individuals who were witnesses to the Senate inquiry into donor-conceived practices in Australia was intense. They told of their search for their biological parents, to know their identity. These young adults were brought into the world without knowing the identity of both a mum and a dad. The sperm from an anonymous male ensured the link to their biological father was cut forever. One report says that there are up to 60,000 donor-conceived individuals in Australia today, with many of these not knowing their biological brothers and sisters. This committee, which I chaired in February this year, unanimously called for the prohibition on donor anonymity and the protection of the welfare and interests of donor-conceived children. The tragedy experienced by donor-conceived offspring who were denied their genetic heritage must never happen again. These donor-conceived practices were based on the perceived rights of individuals to have children, the entitlement of these adults to children and the right of sperm donors to be anonymous. We now know this was terribly wrong and had tragic consequences, but it was based on the so-called rights of the individual. Homosexual marriage would sadly perpetuate this tragedy by denying children the right to know and be nurtured by both a mother and a father. Children deserve the right to grow up with at least the chance of a mum and a dad. Homosexual marriage would deny them that right. Marriage is a bedrock institution. It's worthy of protection. Marriage is an enduring institution, having been with us for thousands of years, across cultures, across religions. Despite minor changes to the definition of marriage over time, it has always been between a man and a woman. It is a social institution which specifically benefits children and is designed to ensure their welfare is maximised. It provides for stability in society. Marriage is not a fashion to be updated, and there should be no doubt about its definition. The marriage debate to date, in my view, has been adult-centred. There needs to be a far greater focus, in my view, on the best interests of the child. The rights of kids have been neglected in this debate to date. Children should not be left vulnerable within a new and novel social experiment. If it were not for the rights of children, they being one of the vulnerable and voiceless groups in our society, the state, via the parliament or the government, would have little interest in regulating its existence. The state is rarely involved in regulating personal and private relationships. It is said that marriage is merely the coupling of two adults with commitment and in love. However, I believe that it's an institution that's more than that. It is centred on the welfare of children before the interests of adults. It serves the interests of the community by providing stable and secure homes to children. Homosexual couple relationships have been recognised in law in most states in an official relationship register, and this is appropriate in my view, but these relationships do not constitute marriage. I acknowledge that the Honourable Michael Kirby and his long-term relationship with his partner, and I don't know if their relationship is registered, but that is a matter for them. But this relationship in itself does not constitute marriage. The marriage union is publicly recognised and treated as special and unique, distinguished from other types of relationships because of its unique capacity to generate children and meet children's needs. Of course, not all married couples have children, and many married couples adopt, but marriage is the foundation stone for procreation. In my view, every child entering this world should have a reasonable expectation, all things being equal, to have both a mother and a father. Of course, this is not always the case. Accidents, tragedy and family breakdown is not uncommon. As a community, we should admire and provide support wherever possible for single parents. Many kids crave the role model of an absent or lost parent, a father or a mother. But marriage as the union of a man and a woman is an objective, natural reality that reflects the biological and complementary nature of motherhood and fatherhood. Homosexual relationships are different to heterosexual relationships in relation to childbearing. If a homosexual couple wants a child, a third party has to be brought in. The natural father or mother will be excluded from raising a child, and this, in my view, is unfair on the child. I cite a recent New South Wales Supreme Court example where a father's identity was legally removed from his biological daughter's birth certificate. The young girl of 9 years now officially has two mothers, a biological mother and her estranged lesbian partner, but no father. The father visited the girl every 2 weeks and paid maintenance for 9 years. Now, he doesn't even legally exist as the biological father of that girl. Whose rights are being considered here? Is it fair or appropriate? What precedent has been set for the future? In short, natural marriage says that mums and dads must take responsibility for the children that they conceive. Children have a right to the nurture of their natural mums and dads, and they have a right to a relationship with their natural brothers and sisters, cousins and broader family members. Same-sex marriage denies them that right. Same-sex marriage says mums and dads can pass off the responsibility for children they conceive to others, that children have no inherent right to the nurture of their natural mums and dads, and that children don't need a father, or that children don't need a mother. And finally, that children have no inherent right to have a relationship with their brothers, sisters, cousins and the broader family. So by broadening the definition of marriage, it actually reduces and diminishes its meaning. It becomes a matter of choice by adults, for adults, and is designed to serve the interests of adults. The interests of children are neglected. Marriage is deeply and uniquely oriented to bearing and rearing children. Homosexual marriage says there is no necessity for a child to experience both fathering and mothering in the family. The best available research indicates that as a general rule, children fare best on almost every indicator of well-being when reared by the wedded biological parents, for example, educational achievement, emotional health, rates of anxiety, depression, substance abuse and suicide, familial and sexual development, and child and adult behaviour. And that source is the Witherspoon Institute, Marriage and the Public Good 10 Principles. The Australian ethicist and UN advisor Dr. Nicholas Tonti-Filippini said this: "Marriage in the Marriage Act is the most secure relationship for generating and nurturing the rising generation." I agree. Gay lobby activists have often claimed that Australia should be more progressive and catch up with the rest of the world when it comes to same-sex marriage. But based on my latest research, only 10 countries out of the nearly 200 countries we have in the world have legalised same-sex marriage. Not a very high percentage. Who should be catching up with who? In the US, only 5 of the 50 states have legalised same-sex marriage. And in the 30 of the 50 US states where a referendum has been held, in every one of those referendums, the people said no to same-sex marriage. This included the more progressive California, where the legislature had previously enacted and supported same-sex marriage. It was turned back. In recent months, the French Parliament rejected legislation for same-sex marriage. The Australian Human Rights Commission and gay lobby activists have often claimed that denying homosexuals the right to same-sex marriage is a breach of human rights. In 2010, just last year, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that its member states were not obliged to recognise same-sex marriage on the human rights grounds. The French Constitutional Court has recently likewise ruled that natural marriage laws were not a breach of human rights. On the contrary, I would contend that there is a very strong argument that same-sex marriage, if it were introduced in Australia, would breach the most popularly signed UN convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and I specifically refer to Articles 7, 8, 9 and 18. Article 9.1 reads that parties shall ensure that a child shall not be separated from his or her parents against their will. Article 18.1 says both parents have common responsibility for the upbringing and development of the child. The best interest of the child will be their basic concern. Federal Parliament. Marriage in Australia means the union of a man and a woman, to the exclusion of all others, voluntarily entered into for life. And although this definition was only formally inserted into the Marriage Act 1961 in 2004, it is neither recent nor arbitrary. The definition is derived from the common law, and that common law ultimately reflects the fundamentals of human biology and the deep and unique interest of the state in protecting and supporting children. On the 31st of March 2004, I drafted a letter to the Prime Minister John Howard, signed by some 30 coalition colleagues, seeking this amendment because doubts were increasing as a result of court decisions. The letter had the intended effect, and ultimately bipartisan support was obtained. But today we live on a cliff's edge, with the Labor Party conflicted, notwithstanding a clear and public pre-election commitment by Prime Minister Julia Gillard that the definition of marriage between a man and a woman would not be changed. The push, and I acknowledge this, the push for same-sex marriage has momentum. The gay lobby often say the community supports same-sex marriage, but Adam Bandt's motion for members of Parliament to provide feedback was successful, and this feedback was provided to Parliament on the 24th of August this year. What did it say? What were the results? 6 of 30 federal MPs said that their community supported same-sex marriage. The others spoke the opposite. The message clearly that the community is not on side. In addition, I note that there was a Galaxy poll that found that 86% of Australians think children should be raised by their own biological mum and dad. This result suggests strong opposition to same-sex marriage. Sadly, the gay lobby campaign is derogatory of those with an opposing view, accusing them of prejudice, bigotry, hate speech, anti-human rights, and being quote-unquote religious. Of course, if you are purportedly religious or have a Christian perspective, they say your view should be automatically discounted or disregarded altogether. The Christian community and those who support natural marriage have been insulted, offended, and in my view, downright persecuted. It appears that this agenda setting has been aided and abetted by many in the media. Several weeks ago on the ABC's Q&A program, a special guest drew the parallel of those opposed to same-sex marriage to racism, a disingenuous and very hurtful observation. It is designed to gain a certain result and has increasingly shut down open debate in our community. Similarly, as the debate has been raised in the UK, where British businessman Sir Brian Souter recently said it was increasingly difficult for those who supported traditional marriage to speak out. They are being consistently marginalised, he said. The gay lobby campaign calls for marriage equality and the removal of discrimination. But in 2008, no less than 84 federal laws were amended to remove all forms of discrimination against same-sex couples. These laws relating to superannuation, property rights, pensions, etc., they received bipartisan support. And many gay lobby activists at the time, this was only 3 years ago, advised that they were not and would not be seeking same-sex marriage reforms. What a turnaround in less than 3 years. Research by the eminent Professor Patrick Parkinson of the University of Sydney, entitled For Kids' Sake, and I have the report here. This is what he said in that report, Repairing the Social Environment for Australia and Young People. He said, if there is one major demographic change in Western societies that can be linked to a large range of adverse consequences for many children and young people, it is the growth of the numbers of children who experience life in the family other than living with their two biological parents at some point before the age of 15. He went on and said, Professor Parkinson, he said, the number of children who do not reach the age of 15 in an intact family with both of their biological parents has almost doubled within a generation. In conclusion, I'd like to make these points. Broadening the definition of marriage to include those of the same sex is not a tweak or a minor amendment. It is a massive and fundamental change which will turn on its head the definition which we have known for millennia. The revisionist marriage would change the way children are conceived and nurtured. What more significant change to society is possible? Is the gay lobby seeking a minor change to our same-sex marriage laws without the obvious and looming consequences? I think not. If passed, I predict a concerted campaign for symbolism and normalisation and the consequences that will flow from such a change such that it will be unacceptable and intolerable to have a different ethical viewpoint. For example, it's already happening. The Australian newspaper Angela Shanahan referred to a UK married couple of 40 years who, because of their Christian beliefs on homosexuality, were disqualified as foster parents. In their application, they had made a point of saying that they would respect and support children who thought they might be gay, but they were not going to encourage it or affirm it as right. This was not an acceptable position, and their application was denied. Marriage celebrants may be compelled to authorise homosexual marriage. It was recently reported that financial penalties are now being imposed in Canada on marriage celebrants who defy the law and refuse to marry same-sex couples. The law has an educative role. There will be changes in our schools and to the school curriculum. Christian schools will have particular concerns in terms of employment, policy and practices. Teachers would be required to tell their students that marriage is about love and commitment to meet adult needs, rather than what is in the best interests of children. And this is despite the fact that in any antenatal class you attend, there is enormous emphasis on the intrinsic value of the unique relationship of a biological father and a biological mother. Not to mention the same training messages that are given to parents in their preparation to take up foster care. This contradicts the views of same-sex marriage that says that it does not matter at all, as is being suggested as an option for our Australian passports, parent 1 and parent 2, rather than mother and father. Does all this really matter? If we don't speak now, it is possible we could lose the right to speak at all. To have a different ethical viewpoint is fast becoming politically incorrect, unacceptable, and not tolerated. Along with many others, I believe the community has a duty to speak up for children, for the vulnerable, and for those who cannot speak for themselves, if not for themselves and the next generation. If the definition of marriage is changed by federal parliament, in my view, it will continue to be the subject of change. Marriage in Australia is voluntary. We do not authorise marriages by compulsion or arrangement, although this is the case in many countries in the world. Marriages in Australia are between two people. We do not authorise polygamy, which would legally become a possibility under the laws proposed by the Greens in the Senate. The exclusivity clause, for example, was not included in their original legislation proposed by Green Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. In this regard, the push for polygamist relationships is now being tested in the courts in Canada, where same-sex marriage has been legalised, and the gay lobby say it is a far-fetched argument. But the facts say differently. It will be important to consider the viewpoints of others, such as the Islamic community, including those here in Western Sydney, and their values regarding marriage. What marriage laws do we want to define for us here in Australian society? Our marriage laws apply age limits and do not allow for incest. Rightly so. But why? To protect the interests of children, both now and into the future. In the news recently in Mexico, a proposal was put forward in the Parliament to have a new kind of marriage licence that is only valid for 2 years, such that when the term ends, the contract simply ends unless the couple mutually agree to renew. So a 2-year marriage, how about that? The argument goes that you wouldn't have to go through the tortuous process of divorce if it's all about love. But what is love? Is marriage only about love, however individuals may define it? Or is it also about discipline and the implications for others, including children? Marriage is not perfect. In fact, it can be painful and problematic with daily challenges. Marriage breakdown and the consequences appear to be increasing in severity and impact for not only our children but society as a whole. But this does not mean we should throw out natural marriage as an institution altogether. In fact, as a community, we should be doing all we can to support it, and in this regard, I've long supported government funding, support for both pre-marriage and post-marriage counselling and education. My wife Kate and I are currently partway through a marriage enrichment course. We're enjoying it and we're still learning. There's lots of improving to do. In respect to any major change to a fundamental bedrock institution such as marriage and its impact on children and its consequences for our community, I say the burden of proof should be on the proponents to ensure that the risks, both known and unknown, and the consequences of such change will not disadvantage our children and our community. A precautionary principle is required. In conclusion, in the end, we have two competing rights: that of a homosexual adult and their same-sex partner to the revised definition of marriage, and the rights of children to know their biological father and mother, and where possible to be reared and nurtured by them. Being a child in a same-sex couple relationship happens, but it is not the norm, and children in normal circumstances should have the right to both a mother and a father. I quote Margaret Somerville, Canadian Professor of Law and Medicine, where she said, "Marriage provides the right to marry and found a family. Homosexual marriage unlinks marriage from biology and denies children the right to both a mother and a father." I think Australians have little idea about where this debate could be taking us. We need to consider the consequences. This is not a fine-tuning of our marriage laws. It will turn on its head a fundamental bedrock institution that has served our community well and protected and supported our children and future generations. And the fact that we're having this debate is excellent, and I congratulate the organisers. Thank you.
Michael Kirby doesn't really require introduction in this university. He's simply one of us. We call him Professor Kirby because he is adjunct professor at a faculty of law, and he spoke at this forum previously. But looking at his previous lives, he had very distinguished legal career. He was judge of the High Court of Australia. He was president of the New South Wales Court of Appeals. He was inaugural chairman of Australian Law Reform Commission, deputy president of Australian Conciliation Arbitration Commission, and I can go on and on. Perhaps I would like to mention some of his national and international involvements. He's a member of World Health Organization's Global Commission on AIDS. He's president, or he was president of the International Commission of Jurists. And I must say he's also a patron of an organization I'm associated with, National Committee for Human Rights Education. To me, basically, he's a great human rights champion. Please welcome Michael Kirby.
Thank you very much, Sev, and fellow citizens. It's a wonderful thing that we're meeting here to talk about a matter of importance for our country, and for notions of equality and justice in our country. I'm very glad that the former Senator, Guy Barnett, came here today. I don't remember that meeting which we had, but I've done an awful lot of talking around this country in my law reform and earlier manifestations, and I'm very glad that we met so long ago, and very pleased that the University of Western Sydney and the Whitlam Institute made sure that we had a real and genuine debate today, and that Guy Barnett has put forward his arguments quietly and respectfully, and that's how we're going to sort this issue out in Australia, not by screaming and shouting and banging and causing fuss and causing trouble, but by quiet dialogue, which we hope in the democratic manner of Australia will ultimately come to just and modern outcomes. I want to make a few things clear at the beginning. First of all, I am not a speaker for the gay lobby. I don't know who the gay lobby are. I don't have anything to do with equal marriage or whatever the organisation is. I'm not even absolutely sure, and my partner and I are not absolutely sure, that if marriage existed for same-sex couples, we would get married. We've been together in a loving and faithful and supporting relationship over 42 years. And when you get to that point over such a long time, you don't necessarily want to fiddle with it, because it's something that really is very, very precious. And we've had a lot of horrible things happen to us, horrible people who've tried to do things to us, and we're still going strong. And I tell all of this in my wonderful new book. This is a book, it's amazingly cheap. I mean, it sells for $35. That's the recommended retail price. But I believe it's even now, it's been discounted. And $29 will probably get it for you in Queen Street in Parramatta. And in it is just the story of our life. It's a very ordinary and rather boring story, actually, that we met in a pub. Now, meeting in pubs, whether you're straight or gay, is quite a good thing in Sydney. Lots of people meet. The Crown Princess of Denmark got hitched after she met a person in a pub in Sydney, and also a member of our royal family, Princess Anne's daughter, married recently a person she met in a pub. So watch it. pubs in Sydney are very, very vibrant places. And in here is just the simple story of my meeting my partner, Johan, and how lucky I was. I mean, every day of my public life, he's been there. He had to be hidden for a long time, but every day I go home, I say, you'll never believe what happened to me today. You'll never believe how awful things were and so on. And sometimes, not always, he gives support. He's very Dutch. They're extremely troublesome people, and they don't take any nonsense and they tell it as it is. And that's how I've kept sane all these years. And it's been wonderful. I'm very lucky, and I hope it will continue in good fortune for the rest of our days. I grew up in a very loving heterosexual family. My mother and father were young parents. We were 5 originally, but my second brother, Donald, had a twin who died of pneumonia during the war. And so we became 4. And I know the blessings of a heterosexual family. I know the blessings of a sort of standard picture book family, because that's what I grew up in. And I honour that family. And I grew up in the Anglican Church, and I still stick with my church. And I won't have anybody try to take Jesus out of my life. I don't want to make a big thing about it. It's a private matter. I believe in secularism. I think it's a rather unfortunate thing that lately we've had a lot of talk about religion. We didn't used to have that in Australia. It was the private zone. We were a secular country, and I want Australia to go back to being a secular country and not trying to have some people, whether they're a Christian or Islamic or anybody else, say, well, you can't do this because that will offend my religion. That's not how we used to be in Australia. We followed the great British tradition of secularism, and we did that because we learned from history. King Edward VI burned all the Catholics. Queen Mary I burned all the Protestants. And along came Queen Elizabeth II, Queen Elizabeth I, who was a very intelligent woman, and she said, enough of this. And so we began a process that we just took religion and people's religious views out of the public zone to a great extent. And in Australia, we were always pretty strong on this, and I think we should get back to it, because increasing numbers of people who've come to Australia, I see this in my own school, Fort Street, are not Christian at all, and they don't necessarily go along with the religious views, for example, that I hold. My partner has no time for religion. He says, how can you, such an intelligent man, take any credence of all this? They've always been horrible to women. They've always been horrible to people of colour. And they've always, especially, been horrible to gays. I cannot understand how you can leave them, give it away. They'll be happier, you'll be happier, everyone will be happier. But I won't give it away. And I start and am where I began. I am an ordinary Australian who has a loving relationship, who grew up in a Christian heterosexual family, which I honour. And the question is, should marriage be opened up for a couple who've had 42 years together? That's the question. And of course, it didn't used to be so, but then those feisty Dutch, they're very troublesome people, but they began all this. We can blame the Dutch for this, because back there in the 1990s, in the Netherlands, with very strong commitments and not being hidebound by the past, they began to say, why should we not open up marriage to people who are in loving and long-term relationships? Why shouldn't we open that up to them? And because they're not hidebound, they did it, and it was supported by most of the members of their legislature. It was supported by people of different religions. Today it's just taken for granted, and very large numbers of people have taken advantage of it. Now, Mr. Barnett is very worried about children, and I'm very worried about children. I'm very worried about all those straight marriages that are breaking down and abandoning and neglecting children. These are mainly heterosexual people. These are mainly the people who you say are the only ones who can have a faithful and loving marriage relationship. What Professor Parkinson, I know Patrick Parkinson. Professor Parkinson didn't say anything against gay marriage, nothing. He was concerned about children lacking loving parents. And I'm concerned about that, and most of that is heterosexual serial relationships. And I can tell you, as somebody who sat in the court system of this country for a very long time, 34 years altogether, that the cases of incest that you are worried about, and the cases of abuse of children, and the cases of neglect of children, are cases that are often related to serial heterosexual relationships. If you want a really good book on homosexual relationships and children to homosexual relationships, there's an excellent new book by Dr. Paula Gerber of Monash University, which actually studies the data. And the data is extremely supportive to the criterion is not the sexuality, the orientation of the couple, but whether they stick together and love their child. That's what matters. And that's what I had all my life. And that's what every child should have. So I understand the concern, and I'm sincere in respecting Guy Barnett, because he didn't have to come here from Tasmania today, and he's put his arguments, and I'm sure they're very sincere and they're shared by many people. But they are not, I think, convincing arguments. And to say that 10 countries is only a fraction of the world, well, it's an awful big fraction, because if you add up all the millions of people in those countries that now live in societies that have opened up their marriage to homosexual people, it's a very significant proportion in effectively 10 years. In 10 years. And we don't normally in Australia design our legislation and our rights of our citizens by reference to what's happening in Outer Mongolia or in countries that are absolutely different. We tend to look at countries that are like us, and it's those countries that have made the opening up of marriage to gay people. It's the Netherlands, Belgium. Now, Belgium had to follow the Netherlands very quickly because they're next door. And then there was Scandinavia, the countries in Scandinavia, and very quickly Catholic Spain. The Pope went there. He was very upset about this. But the Spanish Zapatero, if you ever want to read a speech by a wonderful person who saw it, who got it, read the speech by Zapatero, the Prime Minister of Spain. He said, we're not doing this for strangers, we're doing this for our brothers, our sisters, for our neighbours, for our families, for people who are our co-workers. We're doing it for people of all kinds in our society. This is a greater liberation of Spain, and this is for everyone. Portugal then quickly followed, and Catholic Argentina followed. So, and then you add Canada and South Africa. They're countries with a legal system very similar to ours. Don't worry, as Joe Bjelke-Petersen used to say, don't you worry too much about Romania or about Azerbaijan. They're not the standard for us. It's the sort of countries that have taken this step. And what's the real argument about it? Well, Mr. Barnett is very worried about children. Okay, I'm worried about children too, but I don't think the two ships are going to meet in the night. I saw when I was walking to work at about 5 a.m. the other day, a signal that came up, you know, in Martin Place where they've got those moving signals. It had the happy news that the Duchess of Alva in Spain is going to remarry. And I was delighted for Her Royal Highness. The only thing is Her Royal Highness is 85. And I think the prospects of Her Royal Highness giving birth at 85, well, it might be a miracle. It might be a papal miracle, I don't know, but it seems unlikely. Who would dare to say that the Duchess of Alba can't get married just because she can't have children? And who says that every gay person wants children? I don't know that I would have been I certainly would have been wouldn't have been as good a father as my father was. My father devoted so much time. Look at me. All I do is work. I would have been very neglectful. And therefore it's two ships that are missing in the night, because we're deciding this by reference to the rights of children, but not every gay person wants children. And not every straight person wants children. And, by the way, not every straight person is getting married in a church. The churches are losing their adherents. The churches are so worried about the bits and pieces of human anatomy that they're losing their adherents, and people aren't going to them. Only 1/3 of marriages in Australia are taking place in churches now. Most marriages are taking place with marriage celebrants. And by the way, in relation to Mr. Barnett's statement that it's a horrible thing that marriage celebrants might get sacked if they won't perform the marriage if that were opened up to gay people, I don't agree at all. I would not, and I've never known any gay person who says they would force a religious person to marry somebody against their spiritual and other religious doctrinal beliefs. But if you are an official, if you're an official of the state, or if you have accepted an office under the state and you're not protected by religious exclusion, then as far as I'm concerned, you have to do the duties of the state, or you have to opt out and do some other job. And that, I think, is, you wouldn't, what a world we would come to if judges said, oh, well, I won't sit in that case because that will offend my religious beliefs. I don't think that's how you can run. If you take the Queen's shilling, I'm afraid, you've got to do the duties. And so I don't really think that's a terribly good argument. And in the end, it all comes down to this, it seems to me, that we've got to restore secularism in Australia. We've got to respect people's religious beliefs, but they have no right to impose their religious beliefs on other people in the fundamental entitlements of other people and in their fulfilment of their human dignity in full citizenship of this fair country as a secular community, a secular commonwealth which respects everybody in the country and doesn't just confine its respect to people of a religious persuasion. We've got to get back to an embrace of secularism. And that is not, I'm afraid to say, what the direction in which we're going. I saw today, or yesterday, the statement attributed to another former senatorial colleague of Mr. Barnett, Senator Kenyon in South Australia, who attacked Senator Penny Wong and said she had no right to get married. It's in this morning's Australian. She had no right to get married, and the child of that marriage is lacking a father, and it's not her genetic child, and that it's not good for the child, and so on. And I thought I'd look up Senator Kenyon. I didn't know Senator Kenyon. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him. Unlike the former Senator Barnett, I don't think I've ever given a speech for the young Labor people in South Australia, so I don't know him, but I looked him up, and he's a member of the SDA. Now, that's the Shop Distributive and Allied Union. And I'm beginning to wonder, what have gays ever done to the shop assistants? I mean, why do they hate us? Why are they being so beastly to us? I mean, I don't like to say this, but I think a few of them might even be gay. And if you ever watched Are You Being Served? Well, most of them seem to be gay. So why does the SDA hate us? And why is it always those people who are jumping up and down and being very rude? I thought it was very rude to Senator Wong. Anyway, all of these things are told in another book. I've come with 2 books. This is being launched on Sunday. It's called Speak Now. You remember that marvellous point in the marriage service, at least in the Anglican marriage service, speak now or forever hold your peace when the moment comes. And this is Speak Now, and it's essays about same-sex marriage. It has the skeptics, it has the supporters, has some opponents, and stories of people who've opposed it are told. There aren't enough opponents. It's a shame they didn't ask Mr. Barnett to write. And I said in here, I think that's a pity, because if you're going to have a dialogue, you've got to have all points of view. And that's why I honour Guy for coming here today and sharing his view. But this is going to be launched at Glee Books on Sunday, and I'm launching this book, and Victor Marsh, who is the editor of this book, is launching my book. And the reason for that is I didn't want to be like Napoleon, crowning myself in Notre Dame, and so they're both going to be launched, and they'll be in every bookshop next week. I believe that this book has sold out. I mean, I believe it's now one of the best-selling books in the nation. And that was probably because the Australian carried a little snippet. It was a teaser about my meeting Johan, my partner, and what a lovely man. And I had a photo of him, which I took within days of our meeting. And, you know, I don't like to say this, but he was gorgeous. And he's still gorgeous to me. He's got beautiful blue eyes. He's a really nice man. He's got his feet on the ground. He's not up in the clouds like I am. He's a very good Australian citizen. And it isn't enough to look after the moolah, the money. You say it went through the Parliament without support. But for 10 years before that legislation was introduced by Mr. Rudd, I was endeavouring to persuade the government of which you remember, the Howard government, to support my partner's rights under the Judicial Pensions Act and to have an amendment to that act. And we couldn't get an answer out of Mr. Darryl Williams, couldn't get an answer. And the justices of the High Court, by majority, voted to have asked that the act be amended, couldn't get an answer. And ultimately, Mr. Ruddock, who was willing to do nasty things sometimes, Philip Ruddock said, it's not a priority for our government, not a priority. And therefore, you say it passed without support. Well, why did it take all that time? Why did it take 10 years? Why did it take all that time in Tasmania to reform the criminal law and the criminalisation of gays? There's been too much of this, and in the name of religion. Well, get religion out of our lives, our private and personal lives. Get religion out of the legislation of this fair Commonwealth. Make our Commonwealth a Commonwealth for all Australians, and open up marriage just as other countries like ours have for gay people. They don't all want children, and it's not a necessary consequence that they will have children, and it's certainly not a necessary consequence on Dr. Paula Gerber's research that they'll be neglecting their children. And I think straight people have got to get their house in order. That's really what the priority is. And as for gay people who are loving and kind and supportive, there is nothing so wonderful in life as to have a partner who you love and who loves you, who is tender and gentle and kind. And every human being deserves that. And that is a very precious thing in a human life and should not be denigrated or made second class. We used to denigrate and in some parts of the world forbid marriage between people of a different race. And that doesn't exist in Australia. And yet we forbid people to marry because of their sexual orientation. Well, it's over. It's over, and the battle is won. It'll take a little time, but it'll happen, and it'll happen quickly, and it should happen.